Right. So, what we discussed in context to the microservices advanced level, earlier we had discussed about what are the different OAuth rules we have, like resource owner. At the
Yes,
same time, we have discussed even about authorization server, resource server, followed by uh, client application, right? So, this is different roles as far as OAuth itself is concerned is what something which we discussed. In this regard, generally, whenever we are working on these roles and all, as in I have explained about the process of both when it comes to the implementation, like resource owner, authorization server, etc., all that. Followed by this, even we discussed about the kind of protocol endpoints, right? So there are different protocol endpoints we have. So which normally these protocol endpoints will be of two different authorization servers. Like one is about authorization endpoint, and the next one about token endpoint, right? So these are the two different authorization endpoints we have discussed. I think if I'm not wrong, I think this is what we have discussed. Or else uh, 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 let me explain from that point of view, right? So protocol endpoints is what let me explain you. So the once the protocol endpoints was discussed and all that, so the next we need to know about the protocol flow. Whatever I may showing you now, this is all something which comes under OAuth protocol flow is all about. Now, when it comes to the protocol endpoints, usually uh, when it comes to the authorization process, especially when we are implementing OAuth 2.0, so majorly there are two authorization server endpoints which normally we use. Let me write down here. Uh, yeah. So I'm going to write here. Okay. So if you want, you can make a note of it. Right. So
yeah,
when it comes to the uh, protocol endpoints, so when it comes to the protocol endpoints, normally protocol endpoints authorization servers are classified into two parts. So the first one about authorization endpoint. This is first point. Second one about token endpoint. These are the uh, two different server endpoints which normally we have. Now, when it comes to the authorization endpoint itself is concerned, authorization endpoint majorly focuses and as well as understand about the authorization process as well as both authorization, all that. At the same time, when it comes to the token endpoint itself is concerned, usually it is of both token point. Normally, when we are working on authorization endpoint, majorly this is something this we used in the used by the client applications, because whenever we are working on some client applications, if we want to obtain any kind of authorization from resource owners or something of that sort, right? If that was the requirement we have, generally this authorization endpoint is something which normally we use. So majorly when it comes to the authorization endpoint itself is concerned, whatever the kind of accessing of this, especially in this endpoint and all, whatever the accessing of the endpoints and all. But make sure we have to have resource owner authentication and all, everything is important. So unless until if we don't have any resource owner authentications and all that, so these authorization endpoints are not something will not be of much useful here. So when it comes to the, especially whenever we are working on microservices, because that's where generally we are discussing, right? So whenever we are working on this microservices, when we are implementing this microservices projects, etc., all that. So what is that we have to do is we need to define resource owner credentials and all everything in the application first, because resource owner role is one of the key element we have to be focused. So we have to define resource owner credentials and all everything in the application first. At the same time, subsequently, whatever the kind of property files across all microservices we are using. So for that, the kind of authentication and authorization process, which normally connects to the authorization endpoint in regular intervals. But whereas when it comes to the token endpoint itself is concerned, generally this token endpoint majorly used in the client applications also. But majorly this is the one which majorly used to obtain usually an access token and all everything from the authorization servers, because whatever the tokens we are going to release, right? So because whenever we are going to access the endpoint needs and all for client authentication and all, there is a release of token which normally we have to create. But end of the day, when we try to understand about the scope of this, either it can be an authorization endpoint or token endpoint. So major advantage and as well as major scope, which majorly we see is that it majorly allows the kind of client applications, whatever we are using to a specific scope of the access request. Generally, this is something where generally the scope request and all everything are something which we have to be used as a parameters. Along with that, whenever we are working on authorization endpoint and as well as token endpoint, the kind of parameters we need to be focused more. At the same time, what are the parameters we are informing to the client applications and all everything must be access to the tokens, whatever are we going to issue when and wherever it is required, especially when we are implementing the microservices in any application development is concerned. So these are the two major protocol endpoints which normally we use whenever we are working on implementation in context to the implementation level is concerned. So these are the two different protocol endpoints we are using. One is about authorization endpoint, as I mentioned. At the same time, token endpoint. So these are the two things which normally we are using. Now, when it come back to the authorization protocol flow, if you can see here, this is where generally we call it as oauth protocol flow called as. In this oauth protocol flow, normally there are different processes where where the interaction happens between two things. One is about the client application and other side about resource owner, authorization servers, resource servers, all that. Majorly when it comes to the client application itself is concerned, normally client application will request authorization from the resource owner, because these are the stepwise procedures when we are implementing microservices, which we have to be understood and which we have to be created with. So whenever we are working on the client applications, especially client applications generally request authorization from the resource owners and all, wherein by presenting the resource owners credentials, etc. and all everything in the first level. This is where generally this authorization request and all everything come into existence. This is the first step which normally we do. So this is for that reason, generally it's always important for us that this authorization request and all everything we are presenting through the resource owner and all, whatever the resource owner credentials and all everything we have to be updated with. Next, once we have updated this authorizations from the resource owner details, resource owner credentials, all that by using that. Normally, it's a reply. It's a reply from the resource owner we get to the client application, wherein usually whatever the client applications we are using, it receives the grant of authorization, whatever the authorization grant is required and all everything will be received by the client application against to the request which was made here. Majorly, the kind of credentials which are representing, especially in context to the resource owners, authorization and all everything, maybe it may falls under the different what are the different grant types, like for example, it can be authorization code, it can be implicit, or it can be client credentials, or it can be resource owner password credentials. Right, so these are the different grant types, which grant types and all everything will be used. Of course, what are all grant types and all that I'll discuss it later. So once it is done, I'll explain you about what are the different grant types. So authorization grant types, different grant types, as I told you. So it can be authorization code or implicit or client credentials, right? So different authorization codes we have, or is resource owner password credentials. So these are all the different grant types. Generally, we use it here. Next, we need to focus on the authorization grant. When it comes to the authorization grant itself is concerned, whenever we are working on the client application, majorly it requests access token by presenting both client credentials and all. At the same time, it also acts as an authorization grant with the authorization server whenever we are required. Because authorization server majorly issues access tokens whenever it is required and all everything is what something will be used in this. Whenever the authorization server, whenever we have authorization grant was given, generally there is a possibility where we have to access the tokens, whatever the issue accessing tokens and all everything is what something we have to do. In that context, generally, whatever the authorization server are we going to use and all. So this authorization server usually authenticates whatever the client applications we have. At the same time, what are the client applications we are using and all must be validated, validate the authorization grant, whatever is being given by the client application. So make sure if there is a validity, because this is also something we have to see the validity part, because whatever the authorization grant was given, so that validity should also check with the authorization server. Subsequently, if it is valid and all, whatever the required accesses, whatever the required tokens and all, everything should be accessed and given, will be given subsequently. This is where generally access token come into picture. Next, once we have request and oath protected resources and all from the resource servers and authenticates the access token and all that. The next thing, what is that we need to do? We have to identify the resource server, and we must ensure that whatever the validated access tokens and all everything will be protected by the resources which are sending back from resource servers to the application is what something which we have to be known with. So when it comes to the oath protocol flow itself is concerned, whatever the interaction we have to create and generate from the client application to resource owner or authorization server or resource servers and all everything will falls under these processes. The first one about resource owner, as I told you, resource owner will authorize the request and grant the authorization and all that. So once authorization grant was received by the client application, so authorization server has to issue tokens and all everything, make sure valid credentials and all everything must be given. At the same time, whenever there is an access of token was validated, validating the access token by the resource server and all, whatever the protected resources and all everything has to be validated, and the server and all everything will send a request back to the application when it is required, when we are working on the oath process. This is what generally oath protocol flow, which normally we follow whenever we are working on uh, protocol flow regarding to oath itself is concerned. Clear, Aishwarya? Understood?
Yes, sir.
Right. So this is what generally oath protocol flow itself is concerned.